Bet Sharukkin, the Son of Perdition, by Alan Bonk. Chapter 4. Paul's Rise. Paul, in his 20s, was in the middle of an impassioned speech in front of the newly formed official Assyrian Union. The men were engaged with his every word. Just outside our sense of reality, Paul's spirit helpers and counselors were just as impressed. He's making great progress. Break in time. Paul was in the garden behind the church in Urmia. He has been given unofficial permission to use the facilities as needed. He and a younger assistant went over agendas and strategies. Meriden approached him with drinks in hand. He was in his hospital doctor's uniform. Paul was always glad to see his old friend. "I can always count on you to be early. Are your chores all done? Your mom isn't going to kill me, is she?" Paul said with a smile on his face. "It has been a while," laughed Meriden. Paul discreetly dismissed the assistant. "We'll finish this in the morning." The assistant left quietly. Meriden handed Paul the drink and asked, "You been having dinner with Shiites? I've only been gone a while." "Are you angry?" questioned Paul. No. You know me, I wouldn't be here if I was," Meriden remarked. Paul sat up and looked at Meriden. "I know that many people are very concerned about my Shiite friends, but I believe it is needful if we're going to meet our goals." Meriden's countenance dropped. "I was on duty yesterday when a man was rushed to the ER. We looked through his case and found that he was beaten by a group of Shiites, simply because he had a cross pendant on his neck. His face had been beaten badly beyond recognition. I cried for him, Paul," said Meriden. Paul responded, "I really believe in my heart that I'm leading us in the right direction. You don't have to worry about me," Meriden sighed. "Just so that you know, I'm still supporting our cause." Paul held up his drink. They toasted to the new Assyria. Break in time. At the Assyrian Union office in Tehran, 1979, the phone rang to no end. Paul, now 27, perched on the balcony with several other men. They're craning to watch a huge street protest below. Someone finally picked up the phone and handed it to Paul. Paul looked across the busy room. "It seems like everyone in our network has called me in the last hour. What do you have for me?" he asked, and steps out of the crowd. One of the Union officers responded, "Evidently, the fundamentalist Shiites in Iran have been plotting the Shah's overthrow for quite some time. The Shah's demise is near." Paul just smiled, as he had known all of this for some time, from his spirit sources. The officer anxiously continued, "What will be our move?" "We will remain neutral, mitigate the chance of reprisals from whoever wins the battle. Whatever happens, it will be a mixed bag for us," responded Paul. The noise of protesters being roughed up by the police below distracted Paul from the phone, and the phone was disconnected. The next day, Paul, in his office with Father Ibrahim, the sun-drenched Paul, who stood by the window. Father Ibrahim commented, "You seem amused." The priest walked over to the window. Paul smiled. "I just realized that no country is too big to fall." The spirits in the room smiled at each other, and just outside, a Coca-Cola billboard was torn down. Paul prepared himself for meeting with the Assyrian Union members. He opened the doors in a rush. The room was hushed and grim. A meager crowd of members greeted him. "Where are the others?" Paul asked. "The rest have left the country with their families when the borders were still open." "We all want to leave as well," the union member answered. Paul stepped up. "Don't fear these Islamic State revolutionaries. We're 100,000 people strong. We can wade through this." One of the union members piped up. "The new Iranian government is already closing down our Farsi-speaking churches. We all know that Muslims have a history of killing Assyrians anytime there's a change in the government. In Muslim nations, the minorities suffer, Christians and Jews at the top of the list." Another member stepped forward. "The country is choking under Sharia law. Those who run will be better off than those who stay." Most of them left. Paul continued to work with his Shiite friends, and a new government developed. This new government accommodated Iran's minorities by allowing 5 seats in the parliament for their own elected representatives. Paul and Father Ibrahim just smiled when they heard the news. "Surely one of these seats is mine," Paul said, and they laughed. Paul did eventually get elected to represent the Assyrians in the government. The position was mostly symbolic, but with Paul's spiritual talents, he made the most of the opportunity. He was able to hobnob with Shiites at the highest levels. He was able to get an opportunity to speak in front of the entire Parliament General Assembly. It went well, and Paul was allowed to represent Iran in many diplomatic events, even outside Iran. He, of course, was pressing for his Assyrian restoration. He felt that he must separate the Assyrians from their Christian heritage, as in the West they had been perceived by the Shiites as enemies. We must convince them that the Assyrians are a different kind of Christian, the kind that does not pose a threat to Islam. Break in time. The Assyrian Union has become an international organization with chapters all over the world. They tried to unify and coordinate Assyrians into a cohesive people. Paul became the head of the International Union and moved his main focus to Iraq. Iraq was the main homeland for the Assyrian nation, and if the Assyrians were to have a new nation, it would probably be in northern Iraq. Iraq, under the leadership of Saddam Hussein, challenged the United States in a confrontation in Kuwait. The outcome was a new government in Iraq with a new constitution. This new constitution provided for Iraqi minorities to receive their own autonomous provinces within Iraq, if approved by the Iraqi government. The Kurds of northern Iraq were the first minority in Iraq to receive a province. This is not surprising, since the Kurds are Muslims and are not a threat to Islam. Paul and the Union began to reach out to the international community. This appeared to be helpful, and in early 2014, they received an approval from the Iraqi government to have their own province. The process had begun. None of this was reported in the international press, who saw this development as an internal Iraqi issue. But the implications were not missed by the other Muslims in the Middle East. Paul was in his union office in Tehran, an organized mess of people, boxes, shuttled to and from the office. Paul and his team were celebrating with wine amidst the hectic work going on around them. But within days, Paul, still in his Tehran offices, was preparing his people to leave when the news was heard from Iraq. And a group of Islamic fighters called ISIS have attacked the Iraqi towns of Fallujah and Ramadi. They quickly defeated the Iraqi security forces and moved to Mosul. Paul and Father Ibrahim, with others, listened to a radio report. Sunni Muslims were fighting in Syria, suddenly attacked Iraq. Damage is focused on Mosul, which is to be the capital of the new Assyria. Within days, the city has fallen to ISIS. The Kurds militia have fled the area in total retreat. The international community begins to gather together to keep ISIS from establishing a caliphate in the greater Middle East, the radio reporter announced. Reports came to Paul through the Iraqi-Assyrian Union that the primary targets of ISIS were the Assyrians and other minorities in Mosul. The motives of ISIS was to kill the new Assyrian state before it got formed. It also became apparent that the Iraqi military would not stand and fight to protect the Assyrians. It had only taken 1,500 ISIS fighters to chase off 30,000 Iraqi soldiers. Break in time. Paul and Father Ibrahim went to Asher to get answers. They requested an audience with Asher and was able to see him in Paul's spirit office. Father Ibrahim was included in the session. Paul was mad about the setback. Don't you have any influence on ISIS? Why are they allowed to kill Assyrians? Paul asked angrily. Asher heard Paul and calmly responded. Any real progress always requires blood. The international community hasn't responded with compassion for your cause. They cannot be touched just by your pleas. They now know who you are, and they see your suffering. Public opinion will support your cause. This was not the case before. Father Ibrahim chimed in, but great Asher, how many must be sacrificed? This will not be a genocide. There are Assyrians in Iraq which will not be assets to the new Assyria. See this as a culling of the herd. You need to be patient and wait for my decision, replied Asher. Paul knelt and said, as you command. Asher explained, ISIS is a mix of men from many nations joined together in an attempt to kill or remove any non-Muslim people who wish to live within the Levant. They as a group and as individuals are out of any direct control from any authority other than their own radical views. Islam is a jihad religion, a war-based belief. When these men are wound up and then released, it is nearly impossible to stop them. Even other Muslims will be their victims if they try to intercede. It will be necessary to defeat them militarily. This will be done by an international alliance and will take years to accomplish. Paul grudgingly acknowledged what he had been told. Paul's patience was wearing thin, but he had no choice. Break in time. In 2017, Paul and the Assyrian Union was following the developments in Mosul by the International Military Coalition. Finally, word came from the Iraqi government that ISIS has been completely driven out of Mosul. Both the western and eastern parts were free. the battle left the city in ruins. Entire sections were razed to the ground, and nearly all the Christians had to flee. Paul and Father Ibrahim are in Urmia. They meet with some of Paul's spirit advisors in Paul's spirit office. The efforts of the international community have dissolved after ISIS was driven from Mosul. And now they turn their attention back to the civil war in Syria, Paul said. Father Ibrahim replied, "The Iranians are building a presence in western Syria and is arming her surrogates in Lebanon. Iran wants to destroy Israel because they are a thorn in their side. Israel stands between them and their goal to establish a Shiite caliphate to control all the Middle East." One of Paul's spirit counselors asked to speak. He was acknowledged. Russia knows that Israel could defeat the Syrians and the Shiites if need be. So, they placed Russian troops and equipment in and around Iranian, Syrian government troops. This caused Israel to pause before acting. Any mistakes or miscalculations of any nation could set off a massive battle. Another advisor asked to speak. Paul nodded. This very situation has been anticipated by Israel for some time now. Their response has been to acquire nukes. They have struggled with how to use them. Their first plan was to destroy themselves if their demise seemed imminent. This was called the Masada scenario. But now it seems that they have adopted a different plan, the Samson scenario. They would use the nukes to destroy everyone around them, in effect pulling down the columns of the Philistines, just like Samson. The first advisor followed them up. "We don't know how they plan to deliver the nukes. We hear that they may plant them in strategic locations." Even while this meeting was going on, a spirit messenger arrived at Paul's office and requested for urgent entry. After a few moments, he was brought in. "Lord Assad, king of Syria, has lost his temper with Israel because of their pressure against him and Hezbollah. He has launched a massive attack with his Russian-built missiles deep into Israel. Hezbollah and Hamas have followed suit," the spirit messenger said. "What about Israel?" asked Paul. The messenger added, "The first wave of larger Syrian missiles were intercepted by the Israelis. Some smaller missiles got through, but with little real effect. However, the second and third waves of Assad's missiles did get through, along the coast of Gaza, up through Ashkelon, and north to Tel Aviv. These did substantial damage." "Have they surrendered?" Father Ibrahim asked. The spirit looked down. "No." "So what are they doing?" the priest asks again. "They've destroyed Damascus." "Nukes straight to the city center and out from there. Damascus is nothing but rubble, not even a city. Amman and Tehran have been destroyed as well." There's an eerie silence over the Middle East. Even the airwaves have gone silent. None of the other nations are saying anything. I think they're afraid to. They think that they may be on Israel's kill list, the spirit stated. The spirit advisor from Paul's meeting muttered, "Samson." After a few moments, to collect their thoughts, Paul turned to Father Ibrahim and said, "Militant Islam has pushed too far. None of the remaining nations will be posturing. No high alerts, no threats, nothing. They won't provoke the Jews." The messenger finished his report. "The armies in the field, Assad's, The rebels, Iranians, and Hezbollah have all stood down and began to move towards home. The Spirit began to perk up a little when he says Israel was not untouched. Large areas around the coast were hit. It's obvious that the Jews pulled the trigger just in time. Any longer, and there would not be an Israel. The news that Tehran was destroyed was disturbing to Paul and the rest of the Union members. The Union offices and files were in Tehran. However, just a week before, Asher had warned Father Ibrahim that he and Paul needed to remove as much of the critical information and people out of Tehran as they could. Go to Urmia, Asher said. This warning was not because of an Israeli attack, but because of an imminent asteroid and a second impact from a comet coming from space to the Earth. Paul and Father Ibrahim were somewhat baffled as to why Asher had not seen the Israeli attack more clearly. They were, however, gratified that the loss of life and damage was mitigated by the move. The asteroid struck at a location in the South Atlantic, and the Atlantic Ocean was devastated. Over 60% of the sea life was killed. The shipping was a total loss. The pollution was moving with the currents, and the carnage was expanding. The disturbance in the spirit realm was massive, and Paul's meeting was quickly ended. Paul resorted to radio news for the time being. Turkish radio announced, as the world reels from the impact of the asteroid, a second alert was issued. This time it is a comet. It is hit between the border of India and Bangladesh, India, Pakistan, and to the east coast of Africa. Over 1 billion dead. In just 2 weeks, the entire world has been turned upside down. End of chapter 4.